We're very, very happy to be able to welcome Professor Stefan Auer, who's coming here direct from Hong Kong, and we're going to be able to see an Asian perspective on the European Union, but he's not solely someone who's focused on the EU from an Asian perspective. He also happens to originally come from Slovakia, so we can ask him some questions about East Europe and the EU. And we've just been reading how Hungary and Poland have become the bad boys of the EU. And last week, Stefan, I should tell you, we read in class Krastev's book on After Europe, which presented, I thought, a very, very favourable, in some respects, view of the East European mindset. But anyway, let's start with a few general questions. First thing that comes to mind, Stefan, is how does the EU look from an Asian perspective? I mean, on one view, the Chinese in particular only care about the United States, and that they don't really, they're not very concerned with the EU. Is that fair? Do they care about the EU?
Yeah, I don't know whether I can generalize about Asian perspective, but looking at the situation from Hong Kong, it is quite striking that Hong Kongers look up to the US. If they have any hopes about the geopolitical actor doing anything about their place in the world, they are looking to the US. So despite all the talk of the EU as a geopolitical actor, and Ursula von der Leyen, the new EU Commission president, made a lot of noise when she assumed her position that she wanted to lead a geopolitical commission. I don't think that the EU has that kind of credible presence in the world. What strikes me that the EU is quite weak even in relation to Russia, right? In relation to Turkey, it cannot even find a unified position on Belarus. Well, it ended up with one, but it took a very long time for it to reach it. So I don't know whether people in Hong Kong look at the EU as a strong, credible actor that would contain the authoritarian tendencies of China, for example, etc. Yeah.
What about, I mean, to put the European point of view, well, yes, the EU is not a great military power. It's not a great foreign policy power in the conventional sense of the term. But the EU has an enormous economic footprint, and it is one of the two great regulatory powers in the world, and that it simply can't be ignored because of its regulatory power. Is that something that people in Asia take into consideration?
Yeah, sure. I think that there is a lot to it, right? Of course. I mean, even the changes that occurred in regulation of the internet, I mean, that reaches Hong Kong. So that is the soft power Europe. But I would probably rather share my own perspective. I don't want to tell you what people think in Hong Kong. I don't speak Cantonese, so whatever I say, has its limitations. I understand the idea of soft power Europe, but I think the idea is predicated on a rule-based international order that is disappearing as we speak. So in that sense, I think Europeans live in denial, and the talk about soft power Europe is based on assumptions that are no longer all that credible, right? So in a rule-based international order, a major trading bloc like the EU has tremendous power. But do we live still in such a world? China, Putin's Russia, Xi Jinping's China can get away with whatever they want, and there is no credible hegemonic power that would stand up for the international order. And I don't see the EU, despite all its rhetoric about its geopolitical clout, I don't see the EU playing that role because it has no military capabilities to underpin that claim. The individual European states have some military capabilities, but the EU as a whole is in the process of alienating the UK, which is one of the few credible, geopolitical actors. It has a hostile relationship with Turkey for understandable reasons. It is split on major challenges. So the EU, even as a trading bloc, cannot find a unified position towards China, for example, right? The dependence of German industry on trade with China, makes their position clearly different from some other countries. It cannot find a unified position on Russia, again, where Germany is keen to build up its reliance on gas supplies, etc. So even as a trading bloc, even that soft power Europe based on its economic might, if you want, has its limitations because there is not enough unity. I find it rather depressing that the only unified position that the EU seems to have right now is towards the UK, and the willingness to punish the UK that is about to leave. And I'm obviously simplifying the matters here, but I believe that it is in vital kind of strategic interest of the EU to keep the UK on its side. I mean, is it going to rely on the US instead? It doesn't have that many friendly partners in the world.
Right. You've raised an interesting point there, though, because you said that the rule-based international order is in trouble. And actually, we could put this in an even more pointed way. We live in a world where Trump's America, Xi Jinping's China, and Putin's Russia are all against human rights, or human rights plays no role in their foreign policy. Number one. Number two, Putin's Russia, Trump's America, and Xi Jinping's China share one foreign policy goal, and that is to see the breakup of the European Union. I mean, Trump's fairly open about this. He sends his the Gordon Sondland, the ambassador that he sent. The first thing he said when he arrived to meet the other ambassadors said, "My mission in my job is to see the breakup of the European Union," and that has been Trump's goal. Putin would like that goal, and Xi Jinping would like that goal. So the EU is in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the only slight disagreement that I have is that I still have more hope for the United States than you seem to have, because I wouldn't put Putin's Russia, Xi Jinping's China on the same level as the United States. So President Trump is erratic and incredibly vain and probably quite stupid, but I still think that even when I talk about Putin's Russia, the assumption there is that he really is the leader, right? Who is ultimately responsible for everything. When it's the poisoning of Navalny or whatever goes on in Putin's Russia, the United States is still governed, right? Not just by one individual, and the United States still remains committed to some of the ideals, including the ideals of human rights. So I wouldn't write off the US. We also don't know the outcome of the elections, right? So in 3-4 weeks, the situation can be quite different there. But it is true, and this is partly my point, that we no longer live in, I don't know whether we ever lived, I mean, in a kind of ordered multilateral world based on rules. I mean, that world has been unraveling for quite some time, and Putin, for example, has done a great deal to do that. But the fact that Europeans and Americans, even under Obama administration, allowed Putin to get away with that means that this is the world we live in, and Europeans need to wake up to it. And I don't see any credible signs of that happening. The way in which they negotiate the deal with the UK seems to suggest that they live in denial about it. They assume that the economic power that they have will continue to exist. But that assumption, obviously, is built on the idea that the world remains the way it's been for half a century, right? That some rule-based order prevails. I mean, that is the basic precondition for Europe's prosperity, right? For Germany's prosperity, for Europe's prosperity, these are all global trading relations. It's a trading bloc that lives from, global capitalism that needs rules.
Yes.
So if that really dissipates, then Europe's economic cloud will disappear also.
Yes.
But even Europe's economic cloud, as I pointed out, has its limitations. I mean, the fact that they no longer have kind of IT capabilities that they used to have, or that the Americans have, that they seem that Germany still is not clear about its position on Huawei, right? That it is going to have its IT infrastructure run by communist China. I think that's extraordinary, and that also is going to strengthen the dependency on Xi Jinping's China in terms of energy supplies, dependency on Putin's Russia. So the US remains the only credible actor in the world that still has some commitment to liberal values.
Yes, well, I think you're more optimistic about the United States than I am, and more pessimistic about Europe than I am. But let me just pick up on one of the comments that you made, and that is really the EU's relationship to Britain and post-Brexit. Now, my view is that Brexit poses an existential challenge to the EU, because if the UK flourishes over the next 10 years, it will lead to other countries exiting. So the EU needs to ensure that Britain suffers economically. And I fear that the EU is reluctant to play realpolitik. You seem to have a different view.
Well, you know, a club that relies on its members being frightened to leave because they would not flourish outside of the club is not a very nice club. I mean, that's an argument that Calypso Nicolaides made against the tough stance that the EU is taking towards Britain. That, I mean, if the entire enterprise is based on voluntary cooperation, it shouldn't be necessary to punish a nation that leaves. I mean, this is the 101 lecture in EU studies, right? That the whole project is based on member states volunteering to give up their sovereignty. So if one of them decides to reclaim it, they should be allowed to go. But mind you, I mean, again, that is where we perhaps differ. I am not that worried about the EU. I am concerned about the survival of Western-style liberal democracy. So whatever serves that goal best is the thing to defend. And if the EU becomes an obstacle to Western-style liberal democracy, then I'm happy for it to be redesigned, whatever. I'm more committed to Western-style liberal democracy than the project of Borderless Europe that created many problems that seem to undermine democracy in Europe.
Right. Well, that is a very important point. And I think the premise of your argument is one I share. I think we're both committed to Western democracy, Western civilization more generally. My view is that Western civilization is best protected by having two powerful blocks of states that are protected. One based around North America, the other based around Europe, because I fear that North America is too fragile. It's got populism and evangelical religion that are too dominant here to allow it to become robust defenders of liberal democracy. I'm more hopeful for Europe, but I agree with you. The Europe is extremely weak and in many ways naive about the way that the world works. But surely you don't want to advocate the extreme Eurosceptic position of saying, well, let the EU break up and we can rely on Western democracy to flourish in the context of a Europe of nation states. Is that your view?
No, I think it needs to be reinvented in many ways. And some of the dogmas that have become kind of like accepted as quasi-religious dogmas, including the freedom of movement, need to be kind of re-examined, or the commitment to the single European currency. You shared with me that article by the president of the Hungarian central bank who urged his counterparts to consider the possibility of countries being allowed to leave the Eurozone. And I think that idea is perfectly sensible, and it has supporters among some top intellectuals in Germany, for example. Wolfgang Streeck, right, from a left-wing perspective, has been advocating rethinking of the single European currency for quite some time. Fritz Schaap also And Klaus Auer told me last year, actually, that unlike his former teacher, Jürgen Habermas, he no longer believes that the euro was a good idea, right? So there needs to be a somewhat detached examination of some of the underlying dogmas that seem to have been accepted by EU elites or European elites more generally, and the commitment needs to be firmly towards, a system that works and serves the purpose of democratic governance. So there needs to be more unity in Europe on certain issues, like its relationship to Russia or China, but less unity in other areas. You mentioned the book by Ivan Krastev that is very open and critical of the dysfunctionalities that the regime of open borders, for example, creates, right? Open borders are beneficial to individuals. I personally have benefited from a world without borders that we academics have had for a long time, right? This is the 5th country I live in. But for countries, borders that are completely open within border zero create problems that the EU still struggles to address. I mean, a country like Bulgaria, for example, is unsustainable. Ivan Krastev is from Bulgaria, and 1/10 of its population just left over the last decade or so, right? So if you become sick, you rather do that in Germany or the United Kingdom than in Bulgaria. And you will be probably helped by Bulgarian nurses because they have no reasons to stay in Bulgaria. And the EU is yet to find out solutions to these many problems that many of its ideals have created.
Okay. So we started talking about East Europe, and you raised some very interesting questions along the Ivan Krastev lines. But could I ask you the counterfactual? What do you think would have happened if the Eastern Central European countries had not got into the EU in 2004? Do you think that they would have developed in a liberal democratic direction in the way that they have? What do you think would have gone on in Slovakia or Hungary or Poland?
Well, that is an excellent question, because of course that counterfactual is possible to examine on the basis of what has happened to countries who were less fortunate than the countries of Central Europe and stayed outside of the EU, like Ukraine. And Ukraine is a basket case, politically and economically. So on the whole, it has to be said, it's been beneficial. But we are talking about what happened 30 years ago. And there are very interesting discussions, contestations 30 years ago about what was Europe to become, right? And a Europe that I would advocate would be one that would have allowed the member states more control over their destiny. I mean, it so happens that Margaret Thatcher advocated that kind of Europe, and that's not a good argument to make because so many people hate Margaret Thatcher. But on that one, I think she was correct. She opposed the single European currency because she believed that that project necessitated the level of political unity that Europeans were unlikely to ever achieve, right? And she also advocated the expansion of the what was then European community to happen much faster than that ended up happening. Remember that it took 15 years for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe to be admitted into the EU, and even then they were not admitted on equal terms. So a less strongly politically integrated Europe could have absorbed these countries earlier and more on equal footing than it had happened. And a number of problems that we are dealing with, which is particularly the Eurozone crisis, might not have been with us today.
Yeah, but do you think that if the Eastern Central European countries had just been admitted to a free trade zone, they would have sustained liberal democracy?
Well, no. I mean, obviously, already then, the European community was not just a free trade zone.
Yeah.
It was much more. For scholars of EU integration, legal scholars in particular, thought of what was then the European Community as a quasi-federation. So this is not, it was already a political union. We are talking about the extent of that political unity. I mean, this is one of the problems about the EU debates, actually, when I think about it. It's oftentimes presented as all or nothing, right? So then even you describe me on your blog as a Eurosceptic or something. I'm not a Eurosceptic, that's not the label I would apply. I just want to be open to the idea of a different Europe, and even the freedom of movement, right? It's not all or nothing, right? You can just regulate it a bit more. What David Cameron actually asked the EU partners to consider, and if he was actually granted that request, Brexit might never have happened because you know the majority was minuscule. So some concession along those lines might have gone a long way. So I think that's part of the problem of the EU debates, that whoever criticizes some of the what is considered as fundamental, unnegotiable achievements, like the four freedoms, is then dismissed as a Eurosceptic, and you don't need to engage with those arguments because whatever, I'm a neo-Thatcherite or a reactionary who wants a world of nation states. I'm not arguing that. I mean, Europe before the Treaty of Maastricht already constituted an amazing experiment in shared sovereignty and political union. It was just not as unified politically as Maastricht Treaty kind of pushed it towards. It was not as unified politically as the very existence of the single European currency required.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So where do you see the EU going in the next 10 years? I mean, some people think it's just going to break apart, that Brexit will succeed, other countries will follow, others think it's going to muddle along, you know, reeling from one crisis to the next, but making it. And then a third view is, the optimistic view, it's really going to cohere under a German leadership and it's going to become a big Germanified Europe.
Well, the last scenario, I just think it's not going to happen. That much clarity I have. But I have to say, I grew a bit wary of making predictions. I've been making predictions for the last 10 years that the collapse of the Eurozone was imminent, and we can see that the Eurozone is still with us. I am not sure whether that's a good thing. I think that the departure of Greece from the Eurozone might have made things better if it happened 10 years ago. So right now, I think that muddling through might be the most likely scenario, but I shouldn't be making predictions. I was reminded of a quote in one of the novels by Ernest Hemingway. A character is asked, you know, how he went bankrupt, and his response was two ways: gradually, then suddenly. And then what I've been talking about is the gradual disintegration of Europe. How else do you want to call it? I mean, a major member state is about to leave. The problems of the Eurozone that the EU has struggled with for a decade are nowhere near being resolved. They are being greatly intensified by the COVID-19 crisis, right? Because it so happens that the divisions that we had prior to the outbreak of pandemic are being reinforced. Italy and Spain are particularly badly affected by pandemic and will be badly affected economically by this, while Germany seems to be doing fine, right? So these functionalities of the Eurozone are going to become more pronounced. I can't see more unity emerging, unfortunately, as much as I would wish it on a number of global issues. So muddling through might be the most likely scenario, but how long they can continue muddle through, I honestly don't know.
Okay.
The opposition, I can totally relate to it because it's coherent. I mean, it is a no-brainer. Like the euro is a currency in search of the state, right? Of a state. So if they can create the United States of Europe as a credible geopolitical actor, as a credible economic actor, I'm all for it. But I think I'm more European than you. Wary.
Right.
I mean, you know, like we didn't talk much about Hungary and that part of the world, but it is just genuinely very different. And Krastev gets it, but he's still kind of too optimistic. It's genuinely. I corresponded a bit with Schöpflin, you know Schöpflin.
Yeah.
He was even in Orban's party, maybe still is. And I think his views are quite illuminating. I mean, he's way too conservative for my taste, but he is also very well informed and erudite. And the simple fact is that culturally, politically, Hungarians, Poles are quite different from West Europeans. And I think the problem is that the EU, instead of focusing on the rule of law issues, that would be much easier to agree on, or to settle, or to force them on, right? It's always mixed into this stuff that I don't know how we want to call it, like culture wars or whatever, you know. I think you can have a democracy that's not very open towards gay marriages, for example. Yeah, I am all for gay marriage, but
Yeah.
it's not. It doesn't then turn the regime into a totalitarian regime, right? That kind of issue.
It was interesting though. I was looking at some graph that Politico, some article Politico had just published, and the question was, how committed are you to liberal democracy? And Hungary and Poland score much higher than Slovakia, Latvia, and Bulgaria in terms of their attachment to democratic. I'll send you the article.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I mean, Slovakia is down there at the bottom with Bulgaria.
Yeah, well, there you are. I mean, I'm a bit wary of these surveys because, I took part in a similar study with John Dreisig actually, some 20 years ago, and he was pretty sophisticated approaching it because the problem is how you ask the question, right? Because if you ask people whether they're happy with democracy they have, right, which is probably implied in the question you ask, then if they say they're not happy with it, that probably makes them good Democrats because what they have is a dysfunctional democracy, right?
Right.
So they're rightly critical of it. So I don't know about these surveys, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, most people are committed to Europe and to some understanding of liberal democracy. But you know, I mean, that is another discussion that Krastev takes part in. The very term liberalism has been discredited in Hungary, in Poland, but that doesn't mean that all the people who no longer can use that word are some kind of fascists or closet authoritarians. It is the problem of post-communist transition when you had all these former communists reinventing themselves overnight as you know, pro-European, pro-Western, perfect liberals, screwing people basically, you know, and then pretending that they were social democrats, like in Hungary. Orban's predecessor was a billionaire, Gyurcsány, right? You know, there was that scandal that people forget when he told his party members that they just lied to the people non-stop, right? And screwed them economically. So people still feel today that Orban is actually doing something for them economically, which probably is not, I don't know, it's probably not completely without possibility.
Right.
It must be doing. It is, you know, delivering some social policies and stuff.